has a way of stripping everything away. It doesn't ask if the setting is ideal. It doesn't wait for convenience. It doesn't have respect for timing. When you're hungry, you're hungry. In fact, hunger doesn't even wait to get to the table, does it? It reminds us that we need something outside of ourselves, outside of our body, to sustain us. Hunger is very obvious. Empty stomachs, limited resources, and sometimes it's things we can't control. Paychecks that don't reach the end of the month. But sometimes hunger looks different than a meal. Sometimes hunger is quieter. It's the fatigue of carrying all the responsibility. It's the pressure of the provider. It's the fear that what if what I have isn't enough to go around? In John chapter 6, there's a crowd that gathers, and they are there because they knew Jesus was coming. They're curious, they're hopeful, and eventually they're hungry. Physically, but I think that they're hungry spiritually as well. That's why they're there. And the question shifts from teaching to provision. There's something about meeting someone's physical felt need. Hunger is an easy one, right? It's hard for someone to hear the story of how God's love can transform their life when they're starving and the grumbling of their stomach is so loud. I mean, you've been there before. You've been hungry before. Maybe not starving because, we're Americans, and so that's not common for most of us. Some of us, not most of us. But you've been so hungry that you can't think, or you skipped a meal or forgot to eat, and so your brain's just not working. And so logical thought, reasoning, none of that, it all just kind of goes out the window, and you just need to get something in your body to get your blood sugar back up. But again, not all this hunger is like physical. Sometimes they're just like my issues, my emotional, spiritual, physical issues are so overwhelming that I can't carry the burden anymore. And so when we're living life on mission, when we're sitting around the table with people and hunger is overwhelming, and whether that's physical, emotional, spiritual hunger, when that hunger, that desire, that need for satiation and satisfaction and something more, and the energy that comes from being seen and known and loved is possible, you have the opportunity to change a life. And whether that's a dinner with the family or around the table with coworkers or a backyard barbecue with neighbors, there's something about coming together and sharing stories and letting our walls down and opening our hearts and our minds to tell the story of generosity and healing and grace. And the gospel moves us into these types of spaces. In fact, you see it in Jesus' life and in his teachings all the time. In fact, I'm going to take you to a place where there's so much hunger that there's not even room to set the table in this story. John chapter 6, verse 1 through 14. I'm going to read these 14 verses, and then we'll dive right in. This is often referred to as the feeding of the multitude or the feeding of the 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him, and they saw the signs that he had performed, healing the sick. And when Jesus went up on the mountainside and he sat down with his disciples, the Jewish Passover festival was near, and he looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, and he said, "Where shall we buy enough food?" This is what he says to Philip. "Where shall we buy enough bread for these people to eat?" Verse 6, he asked this only really to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered, "It would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for everyone to just have a bite. There's way too many people here, Jesus. There's no way we can do this." Another one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and says, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go amongst so many people? Have the people sit down. There's plenty of grass for them to have a place to sit. And so they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And so if you think about it, about 5,000 men, maybe they had their spouses, their kids, maybe some of them had servants with them. It's a multitude of people. Then Jesus took the loaves, he gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said this to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign that Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Now, oftentimes you look at this story and we think about the miracle that Jesus performed with the loaves and the fishes, but there's something more here than just the miracle of feeding the multitudes. God meets their real life needs and multiplies what we place in his hand. There's a real generosity story here. There's a real, God can use what I have to partner with me to bring hope to the world. And so what does Jesus do when the scarcity mindset creeps up? Well, he notices that there's a need long before it becomes a crisis. Jesus sees all the people. Jesus is smart enough to realize that they're going to need something to eat. And so the great crowd's coming towards him, and he says to Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all these people? And he says this only to test him because he already had in mind what he was going to do. And then Philip answers with a classic answer of scarcity. There's no way we could afford to feed all these people, not even a bite. The disciples see the crowd, but Jesus sees the people that have a need that needs to be met. And before they will hear what he has to say, he needs to meet that need. And he's willing to do it before the people ask. He's willing to do it before the problem escalates any further. He's willing to do it before hunger turns into panic. Jesus is always in the business of meeting the needs of the people who are right around him, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And see, what I'm talking about is to be a person that extends mercy to others, that we have to be people that pay attention to the needs of other people. Our culture, our life, our world has us very focused on us. And maybe even if we're decent people, it's, like me and my 4, like us 4 and no more kind of mentality, the classic husband, wife, 2 kids. You've got your Suburban in the driveway and your golden retriever in the backyard, and everything is just wonderful. But Jesus already knew what he intended to do, and he invites the disciples into the tension of how do we solve this problem? How do we help these people? And the question isn't about the solution. The question is about them participating. Jesus wants us to partner with him to bring hope to our world. And so Jesus invites us to offer what we have. Other passages say that he says, you get them something to eat. That there's a bit of a panic, and others are saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to feed all these people? Now, in Luke, he records Philip and Jesus' interaction and the fact that Andrew, Simon's brother, says, hey, what are we going to do here? And other gospel writers say that the disciples, and both are true, like it's just the lens by which they're looking through. But if you look at verses 8 and 9, John chapter 6, another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and says, here's a boy with loaves and fishes, but how far would they go amongst so many people? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. I mean, I want you to think about this for a second. Like a couple pieces of pita bread and a couple of sardines, right? Like this is not impressive. In fact, this is more like sardines and crackers. This is more like a Lunchable than it is like a feast. It's not impressive. Honestly, the answer that they have is not even very strategic. It's not scalable. It's just available. I think so many times we're afraid to be generous with what we have because all we have is a child's lunch in our mind. And we think, well, it's not impressive, it's not strategic, it's not scalable, but is it available? When you have something at your disposal and you offer it to God, God will take what you have and he will take what is scarce and he will turn it into abundance. The miracle doesn't begin in abundance. Yes, it ends with abundance, but it begins with surrender. Am I willing to give what I have, even if it's unimpressive and strategically won't meet the needs and doesn't scale beyond the lunch meant for a small boy? But the boy doesn't have the ability to control the outcome. All he has the ability is to be generous with what he has. I like to imagine that the little boy has pressed his way up close to Jesus. He's made his way through the crowd. He hears the conversation and he says, I have a lunch. I like to imagine that the disciples are like, little dude, shut up, man. You got a Lunchable there. You got some fish and some bread. How are we going to feed all these people with that? And at least Andrew has the awareness to go, I mean, I've seen Jesus do miracles before. I mean, it's crazy, but is it possible? And so what happens is this generosity, even though it feels small in the moment, it's just a meal, it's just one bill that I'm paying for this person. It's just one open house. It's just one shared resource. It's just one opportunity to buy milk for the person behind me in the grocery store. It's just one offering that I make. It's just one amount that I give a month to help others. But when this generosity is offered through the lens of mercy, it's multiplied when it's placed in the hands of Jesus. Jesus takes what is given and he multiplies it because it's not supposed to be hoarded. When you hoard, then it rots. But when you share, it becomes exponential. Jesus said, have the people sit down, verses 10 and 11. And there was plenty of grass in that place. And so they sat down, about 5,000 men, and everybody else that was with them. And Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks and he distributed amongst those who were seated as much as they wanted. Jesus gives thanks. Jesus postures himself with gratitude. Before the multiplication happens, before the visible miracle, gratitude precedes the increase. The attitude of gratitude is everything when it comes to my generosity. And so then he distributes, not sparingly, not cautiously. They all have as much as they wanted. Other gospel writers say until they were satisfied, seconds and thirds maybe even. I wonder what the disciples' attitudes were as people were reaching in and taking a piece. Like, no, they got to have enough to go around. Got to be careful. Like, instead of participating in the miracle, were some of them just like only partially participating? When God does a miracle in our lives, when God takes our generosity and he multiplies it, he changes everything. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be financially responsible. It doesn't have to be, like I said, scalable or strategic. It just has to be honest, and the attitude is everything. So what began as barely enough becomes more than enough because mercy doesn't need to ration compassion. And no one is left unseen by Jesus. In this story, Jesus has been going through some trauma of his own. Many believe that Jesus has just gotten news that his cousin has been beheaded, and he's trying to find a quiet place, a solitary place to just kind of be. And he gets on the boat and he heads to the other side because he's already performed a bunch of ministry and miracles. And as he gets in the boat and heads to the other side, the crowd runs around the shoreline to meet him there. in what was supposed to be a small retreat with his friends, a table set for a group of friends, a closed table, a private table, becomes a group of people. And Jesus sees, and many translations say it like this, that he sees them, he has compassion on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And so what does he do? He feeds them. But he doesn't just feed them. Remember how many baskets were left over? John chapter 6, 12 and 13. So they gathered them up, filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes after everyone had eaten. Leftovers. Everyone had had enough, not the most, not the loudest, not the strongest, but all of them, everyone, had eaten till they're full, enough. And there are leftovers. The leftovers matter too, because there's 12 baskets full. Now, remind me, how many disciples are there? Yeah, there's 12. God's mercy isn't just attentive to those who are lost. He doesn't just perform miracles to draw those who are far away from God to himself, but he sees you, Christ follower. He sees you, disciple of Jesus. He sees you, worker in the kingdom. And he says, yes, I'm not only going to provide for them because you participated, because you were generous, because you shared, but I'm going to make sure that you have something as well. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to participate. Nothing gets wasted. Nothing gets overlooked because God's mercy is attentive. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8, the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Corinth, he says, and God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things and all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. This provision isn't about receiving, but it's about the abundance of God. That God provides so that mercy can continue through us. I guess the question becomes whether or not I need God's help or there is a need, because guess what? The need exists. And the question isn't whether or not Jesus is able, because he is. And the question isn't whether I'm willing to participate. Yes, some of us hesitate, but what we have, maybe it feels insignificant. So the question becomes, am I willing to participate? Because the miracle that God's about to perform isn't dependent on your offering, isn't dependent on the size of your lunch, but it simply is dependent on your willingness to surrender. It's about attitude. It's about generosity. It's about giving what I have. This invitation to generosity is not meant to be pressure. I always wondered if, it says in some translations and in some gospel writers' account, it's Andrew, and in others it's Simon or Peter. And we know Peter can be rough around the edges. Like, did he pressure him? Did he manipulate him? Or was it participation? But based off of what I see, it's, no, this little boy said, here's what I have. And so without pressure, without manipulation, just simply an invitation to participate in bringing hope to the world. What would happen if you offered what you had to God, if you placed it in his hands? What needs could be met in a community, in your family, in your workplace, in your environments, in your culture, in your world? And what about around the world? And whether it's an offering, or it's an act of service, or it's you just taking what you have, the ability to listen, a smile, a kind word, or even just your time to sit at the table with others. What could you do to bring hope to the world in your life today? Lord, I thank you. I thank you that you often see the needs that are overlooked by so many. Lord, continue to encourage me to have trust in your ability to do the miraculous. And Lord, I ask for forgiveness for my scarcity mindset that sometimes takes a hold of me. Lord, make me generous, not because I'm afraid of the consequence, but because I believe in your confidence. Lord, in your provision, Lord, in your miraculous work to stretch something as silly as a boy's lunch into a banquet that feeds the multitude and beyond. And so, Lord, I make myself available, my time, my talent, my treasure, my testimony, with an attitude of gratitude to be used by you. I offer what I have. Use it, God, every day. In Jesus' name, amen.